So I first read Robin Hobb's The Farseer Trilogy a while back, even before I finished my first novel. I don't remember what it was that attracted me. Actually, I do remember what was attracted to me. It was the paintings of, it was the live ship trader paintings that John Howe did. I don't remember where I saw them in some collection. I might even have a book of John Howe's art somewhere. His live ship traders art. Live Ship Traders is a trilogy that is connected to the Farseers, for the Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb. If you all don't know, it's not nearly as good as the Farseer series. It's a little bit more. It's set in the kind of Barbary pirate um, world. Everybody's in tri corner hats and things like this. The concept is cool. They have basically these ships that come alive. The wood has the capacity of actually containing the lives of the captains of the ship, and so that they kind of awaken and become very connected with it's kind of the concept is very cool. The books are not so cool. I'm not crazy about them. Not as good as the Farseer, but the art by John Howe is phenomenal. It's right up there with his Lord of the Rings art. Really, really love it. And I started to read it a while back, and I think I don't actually remember a lot of this. Is strange for me. Usually I remember everything that I read. I think I read these books on Kindle, not in physical format, which, by the way, just shows you, as a little anecdotal evidence here, it really makes a difference whether you read a book in physical format or not. Because the digital interface just it encourages you to skim. It can't contain as many words as a proper book can. Um, and there's just something about the backlit nature of it. Even the ones the paperwhite that feel a little bit more like actual paper, they still have a backlit reality. It's still digital. Can't fool your brain all that much. Really, it does make a difference in the reading experience. I think that's one of the reasons I'm listening to the series now on audiobook. After having not read it for about 6 years, I don't remember anything. Just a few very vivid images that are coming up here and there. But that's great because it gives me, an experience of a series that I read all the way through. Nine books. And I liked it, but I remember being annoyed with it as much as I liked it back then. But this experience of it is giving me a lot more insight, a lot more interesting moments. So I'm really enjoying it actually. But something really struck me, Angeline. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just me. I guess it's just me. That's true. I'll tell you. I did read the entirety of George R. R. Martin's series, the Game of Thrones, on an iPhone, and yeah, you can don't forget that stuff, I suppose. So, but I don't know. My little personal experience of reading these books, I forgot a lot, but this time around, I'm really getting into it, and it really struck me. Um, Robin Hobb has a really interesting way of telling story. She goes really deep into the daily reality of these characters. If The Lord of the Rings is world building at its finest, and also a plot that is driven very strongly by a quest narrative that, although some people consider it to wander, none of the wandering is accidental. None of it really is incidental to the larger plot. Everything that happens is absolutely inevitable for the final flowering of the solution at the end, right? Of the denouement in Lord of the Rings. There's not a wasted character. There's not a wasted scene. Everything has its point. Even that funny scene where the fox appears and suddenly we see the perspective of the hobbits from the perspective of a fox. Even that has its proper place in there, if only to demonstrate to the reader that the hobbits really are leaving the everyday world and going into a place where even the foxes are like, what's going on? But Robin Hobb's world, she goes so deep into the daily, mundane, almost details of the lives of these characters that I think some readers kind of bounce off of it, understandably, because actually you could cut out 1/3 of each of the first 3 novels of the Farseer series, and you actually would not lose the plot. You would have a less deep experience of it, sure. You would have a less um, immediate experience of who Fitz is as a character, yes, absolutely. But especially in Royal Assassin, the middle book, all by the way, all her middle books, in my opinion, have that middle book problem where you want things to move more quickly. I do, and they just tend to kind of sit around and luxuriate in the messy middle, the saggy middle of the thing. And what that does, though, an interesting effect happens as a result of that. That means when scenes come that are extremely important in terms of world building or in terms of moving the plot forward or in terms of revealing something about the characters, the world, or the magic system, or the underlying reality, the thing that we're all moving towards, the mystery at the heart of the series, who the red ships are and why are they doing the things that they're doing. Those scenes stand out really, really strongly. They're very powerful because you've been kind of in everyday life for a very long time. So these scenes come out, you're like utterly riveted. And the way she does that, Robin Hobb, it really made me this time as a writer and as a teacher of writing focus in on those scenes. And as they come out like a bas relief out of the substrate of the sculpture, I started to realize that actually it's really interesting what she does because Robin Hobb's worldview is definitely not mine. I'm actually friends with her on Facebook. Rather, I follow her. I don't think she allows for friend requests. And I read her nonfiction every once in a while, like her comments on the world and her views on politics and things like this. They're very, very far from mine. That's not a value judgment. That's just a fact. Um, she's very much of the postmodern world that she's like a classic liberal, right? She is a bleeding heart for the suffering. That is a good thing, by the way. I'm saying that as a compliment. And she bleeds, her heart bleeds for all of her characters, and her characters also embody very much that kind of worldview where the suffering of others is this wound in the face of creation, in the face of reality that cries out to be answered. The injustices, they cry out to be answered, and they're uncomfortable, and you're faced as a reader constantly with this reality, like how are we to live when such pain, when such injustice continues? This is a very classic liberal place from which to start. It's also a very classic liberal place from which to write stories. It's very different, by the way, from both Lewis and Tolkien. Not to say they didn't have bleeding hearts, but who start from the mythic and come down into the mundane. She does the opposite. She starts with the mundane and eventually comes up to the mythic. So you don't have hardly any magic, hardly any dragons, hardly any sort of weird fantasy type stuff until you really get into the third book. And as a result, her treatment of the hero paradigm, of the hero's journey through the eyes of an assassin who is a bastard, in other words, an outsider, the ultimate outsider, and yet who is also a chosen one, is really different and really interesting. In some ways, I think she's also responding to the modern complaint about the traditional heroic journey. That complaint that George R. R. Martin makes about Tolkien, about how in the old heroic stories, everything has to be black and white. The hero has to be white, and the villain has to be black, and may there be no gray in between. I've talked previously many times about how I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at a romantic, old-fashioned, medieval way of uh, relating to the world. It's also an incorrect way of seeing the hero paradigm, but it is a very modern or postmodern way of looking at heroism in general. So that's why George R. R. Martin has this nihilistic vision where even the good are capable of terrible things, and even the terrible are capable of good things. Tolkien and Lewis, by the way, in their romantic return to the old heroic paradigms, are also reacting to heroism gone wrong. They were in World War One. They knew they participated in the ultimate experiment of heroism writ large. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and it did the opposite. It set the stage for the worst loss of human life in history by far. That is part of why the modern world is still reacting against the heroic paradigm because unfortunately, like it or not, these countries that these paradigms that led to World War One and World War Two and fascism and communism and all that were embedded in Western civilization. And as I've demonstrated before, heroism, Western civilization, Christianity, those things are all peas in the same pod. They're all connected. They're all inextricable from each other. And all has to do, of course, with the myth become history of Christ coming to earth. But the modern response to this is, if heroism is this great thing, why is there a suffering child? This is, by the way, the classic atheist complaint about Christianity. So this is all very, very intertwined and very, very similar. That being said, you might think that I would be bristling at Robin Hobb's treatment of the heroic paradigm, because there really is no hero. Fitz is not a hero. Fitz is a very profound human being, a human being with a very deep heart and with a very deep desire to be integrated within himself, to be a good person in a situation where it's very difficult to do so. In some sense, he is a hero because he tries in almost impossible circumstances to always do the good. But he is not a traditional hero. He is a silent killer for the king who goes and does the king's bidding without having recourse to thinking about whether or not this is moral. And he, therefore, and because of various other things, he is, subject to the classic revenge problem, that when you are left with no one and you are abandoned, you as the hero, not as the non-hero, must then follow the only recourse left to you, which in his case is revenge, not a traditional heroic paradigm or story at all. But there's something more going on. Robin Hobb did something truly, truly interesting, and in some ways, I think it might be uh, the best possible answer that modern thought can offer to the classic historic paradigm. I don't think it is a better story vision, worldview than the classical heroic paradigm of Western Christendom, of the ideal of Christianity in the world, not just as something towards which we can reach. But it certainly is a valid one. It's an interesting one, and it is a very compelling one. So I want to go a little bit deeper into that and give you some of my thoughts about how she does this. So for him, there's this wonderful scene at the beginning. It's fairly early in the first book, and it's a very strange scene. It's in one of those epigraphs that apparently Fitz is writing as an old man, although that um, that device that she started with book one and tried to continue with book two thankfully disappears effectively by book three. And I think she kind of abandoned it, even though there is a point at the end of the series where he does try to write down everything. But it's not the end of the series doesn't really jive with the beginning of the series, where he's a very, very old man writing things down and having somebody help him, like an Apostle John with Saint Procopius or something like that. But in any case, there's an early he has these epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter, which is apparently him writing the history of the Farseers. But it's also sprinkled in with various lore, tales, and weird interludes that seemingly come out of nowhere. And one of these was a really interesting scene that describes the naming the naming ritual of buck men. This is a kind of rite of passage from boyhood into early manhood, and it is the giving of a secret name, which is a really cool idea. This is definitely Robin Hobb kind of riffing on Ursula Le Guin's classic Earthsea trope, where the wizard has a secret true name that only he can tell, and he can only pass it on to others that he truly trusts, right? So there's the scene. It's not connected in any other way to the rest of the story, and it's done kind of in this dream style. And if you're not paying attention, you can just almost forget about it existing. But apparently, what happens is Burrich wakes up Fitz as a child and takes him on this secret rite of passage. They're wearing hoods. It's all very kind of crazy, wild, tribal, very not, contemporary, present day Buck, where he receives his name, and his name is given as Catalyst, which is interesting. It's the first time we encounter this word in the series. And then in book two, the Fool, for the first time in chapter 15, I believe, uses the word catalyst with reference to Fitz directly. And this is the first time the Fool talks about his larger purpose. We already know from suggestions in Fitz's skill dreams that the Fool is a kind of prophet. What the significance of him as a prophet What that's going to be, we don't know yet. But then he starts to open up a little bit about his past, and he tells Fitz that he's come here to find Fitz because Fitz is a linchpin. He's a catalyst. He is an agent that causes change around him. And he is an agent of potential destruction because catalysts can create destructive chemical reactions. They just speed up reactions. They don't make them good or bad. They just make things happen, right? Chemically speaking, which is really interesting, right? Because there is like it takes out the whole element of the hero having a moral journey of reaching self-actualization, or rather self what am I looking for? Reaching overcoming of the weaknesses of self to become a better version of himself, to become the hero at the end, right? That's usually what happens here. That there isn't a moral component to it. He just causes change around him, and the morality is entirely limited to him as a person, not to his position as catalyst. In fact, he needs to have someone else, the prophet, to guide him properly. Otherwise, the whole thing might blow up in their face, and it does seem to constantly do so. There's another really interesting scene that shows why Fitz, and by the way, Fitz's reaction to the fool calling him a catalyst is one. He basically calls him a chosen one. The fool does. He calls him a chosen one, but he demonstrates that this chosenness is not one in which he really has the agency that a hero does, the ability to go out of himself into the wilderness, face the dragon, overcome it, and then reach the next level, so to speak. Because every time he does that, he's causing change around him to an incredibly destructive degree. So the catalyst, in some sense, has to limit his activity as much as possible, or rather narrow it into the proper sphere of activity to put it in the right chemical equation, if we're using that analogy further. Otherwise, again, the whole thing can explode in their face. And it keeps doing again and again because Fitz is unable to control himself. And there's reasons for that. We could talk about that later, maybe. But there's a really interesting development of this heroic paradigm as something that isn't heroic, but rather catalyst based, in the scene where Fitz reacts to his valley in the shadow of death. In the traditional heroic paradigm, when the hero comes to his death, the seeming death in fairy tales, that then he rises up from the grave like Christ does, and then receives a different level of illumination and the ability to overcome the dragon for real this time, the beast for real, and his internal demons as well. This does not happen in this catalyst paradigm. He does go through the valley of shadow death. He dies, and he is given new life, rising from the grave, from the ground, in the most classic heroic rising from the dust that you can possibly imagine, the kind of thing that happens in all the Russian fairy tales. And yet his reaction is one of not new insight. It's not one of new power. It is one of utter and total post-traumatic stress. He is somebody who has been beaten down so much that all he can do is not transcend his death and then become the catalyst to save the world, but he is reduced to what happens to soldiers after they kill and they return home. He's reduced to somebody who is forced almost to separate himself from those who love him. Angeline, you're saying you thought he's 20 when he's writing all the things. At the beginning of book 1, he's talking about his hands being unable to hold the pen and his eyes failing. There is a suggestion that this is one of those classic fantasy type narratives where it's a memoir narrative, and he's writing about his childhood, and he's writing about the history of the Farseers as catalyzed by himself. That doesn't happen in the, as you know, in the way that Robin Hobb actually ended up writing the story. There's enough vagueness in the way she describes it that if you didn't know the way that the story actually finishes, right, exactly, you thought it was closure because you know the way the story goes, but she wrote it vaguely enough that actually she was able to make it work. So there isn't a retcon. There's no need for a retcon like Tolkien would have had to do, because he would have gone so deeply into that initial framing device that it would have been impossible to pass it off as weakness having to do with skill withdrawal or any other problem, as we find out in the third series of the Farseers. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But there's a really that response that Fitz has to his valley in the shadow of death is so anti what the hero is supposed to do in the hero's journey, that really stood out to me. And it really stood out to me because I had just started reading The Ethics of Beauty by Timothy Petitsis. It's a really interesting book. The first chapter of that is Dr. Timothy Petitsis' discussion of the fact that the Iliad, in its original form, was actually a communal form of catharsis for former soldiers who had been traumatized by their participation in the ultimate act of cutting themselves off from the human family because they were forced to kill their brothers, their fellow humans. The singing of the Iliad in the company of former warriors, he makes the argument, was actually an act of healing, an act of bringing uh, them back through the liturgy of storytelling into the community of mankind again. He, being a Orthodox Christian writer, makes the argument that that was the old way of dealing with it, and it was incomplete. And his argument is that one of the big problems we have nowadays with uh, uh, soldiers who come back home from war suffering from PTSD is that they have the same kind of um, alienation from the family of humanity that the warriors back in ancient Greece did, because they also killed. And now it's even worse because sometimes you're killing without actually seeing the person that you're killing. It's just pressing a button on a machine and the machine kills. And the human person is one of stripping apart. It's one of the brilliant things that, by the way, uh, Joe, J.K. Rowling did with the Horcruxes. That if you want to have that kind of magic, uh, you have to kill someone because it actually rips your soul apart. She takes it in a literalist direction. Here, that reality is explored in the fact that Fitz, by having to be an assassin, by having to be someone who's on the margins, killing at the order of his king, who then leaves him in the lurch, both his king and his king in waiting. When he comes up from the grave and is faced with the reality that he has to continue doing what he did before, he has to continue to be the non-hero, the one who kills in the shadows, his reaction is one of extreme alienation, of extreme pain, of extreme trauma. And that trauma is expressed in the cutting off of every single possible human tie that he has. And he goes and becomes a wolf for a while, starts living in the moment, in the now. And only after a long time passes is he then, and after the shock of encountering the flip side of what he had become, which is the forged human, the human with no soul, does he then realize that he can't, in spite of his trauma, in spite of his being still in the valley of shadow of death, he has to rise up and he has to keep moving. The best he can do, unfortunately, at that point is to go and try to kill those who caused this. He goes on the revenge journey instead of going on the hero's journey. And he has to be distracted from it by the circumstances surrounding him, by the fact that he's a catalyst. So it's really interesting. Again and again and again, Fitz seems to move through the story, not by acting on it, which is what writing teachers tell you to do. Never have your character be passive. Fitz is in some ways is the most passive of all because every single action he creates, he does not move his uh, story forward. It causes these insane counter reactions that then bounce back on him and do everything in their power to stop his forward movement as catalyst and as hero. It ends up, and so he has to then be rescued constantly by others. But he doesn't come off as passive. He comes off as incredibly active because he's constantly fighting against fate. And this brings us to the fact that in this particular kind of worldview, if you're going to create a catalyst-based heroic paradigm, and if that catalyst-based paradigm is requires a guiding force, then you can't have the catalyst be by himself. He needs to have a flip side to his coin. He has to have the white prophet, the one who guides the catalyst, and only together can they save the world in their particular moment in history. Unfortunately, this is a dualistic worldview. Not unfortunately, in reality, this is a dualistic worldview. It has only two possible faces, yes or no. And what that means is that time in this kind of world can only be a loop that keeps repeating itself. It can never, the wheel of time can never be broken. This is why Fitz suffers. This is why Fitz constantly seems to go through the same problems again and again and again, because he is not a hero who can change the world. He is a pivot point around which the world can change, but it can change either in one way or in another. And it's not entirely dependent on him whether or not the world changes in one direction or another. It leaves him feeling incredibly powerless. It's an incredibly tragic and sad view of the world. It really, really struck me. Why? Because this is very much because okay, so let's go back a little bit then. He, Fitz is unable to be healed from the alienation of his death and his returning to life at the end of book 2. He's unable to transcend his post-traumatic stress disorder. He's unable to reintegrate himself into the family of humanity. He remains outside of it. And as a catalyst, perhaps he has to, because he's the one that changes everything around him. One of the reasons why it's impossible for him to be reintegrated or healed and brought back into the community of man is because Buck is a land with no roots. It really struck me. There is no common storytelling tradition. There is no common culture. There is no common religion. They talk about religion, sort of, but it's very much a personal, private thing for individuals. It's not something that animates the culture at large. This is not a medieval world, even though they dress like medieval people in the traditional fantasy sense. This is very, very much America here and now. It feels like a young country that doesn't have a deep history because they've forgotten it or because they have no connection to it. And it's really interesting because in that kind of situation, it is true. There cannot be a hero in the traditional sense, because the hero in the traditional sense needs the roots. A story needs the roots of worldview, needs the roots of previous heroes walking the path before him that he can then emulate. He can't. They do not exist. Or if they did, and we know that there were white prophets and catalysts before, but there is no memory of what they did. All of that memory is lost. And even when those who try to teach the fool how to become a white prophet properly, even they cannot interpret his prophecies correctly because they want to manipulate what he says to fit their own ends. They're not rooted to the culture, the history that led them to this point. This is America now. It is the world that we live in now. And so Fitz is the only possible hero, a catalyst, a suffering servant around whom everything changes, but who cannot transcend that suffering and then change the world around him in a way that will then also redeem him. It's also one of the reasons why ultimately his story is a great tragedy. Now, the implications of that worldview, they're immense, they're huge. And I will get further into that when I continue reading the series, because at this point it's still unclear to me how all these initial thoughts actually culminate in the final book, in the ending, which is so bittersweet, in some sense beautiful, in another sense is really, really tragic. Of story and song question: is the heroic a type of remembrance that leads back to the memory of God with us, whether embodied by the individual passed on through story? Yeah, I think so. It's not just the memory of God with us, but the reality of community with the divine that can then inform your suffering and give it a path to travel. That it's not simply the buffeting of fate against you that you have to fight against, because it's either that or die. So it's almost like Fitz can only the highest Fitz can get when it comes to a personal worldview is something like Buddhism. Is something like being in the here and now and setting aside suffering as something that happens, but that he's not connected to. Something like Stoicism or Buddhism. It's very interesting, and it's very well thought out. Robin Hobbs, she's really, really properly thought this world through. All the implications of how the world works, how the culture works, and how therefore the hero can only be a certain kind of hero. He cannot be the kind of hero that we would have had in previous historic paradigms, because this is not a world that can actually have such heroes. I think it's fascinating. What does it say about us in America now? Yeah, that's a larger question, and it's kind of a sad one. But more on that when I keep reading into that in our next episode of Fantasy for Our Time. So that's all I have for you all today. If there are any questions, please share them in the comments.